talk about the Texas Annual Conference administration within the United Methodist Denomination. And I'm also going to talk about the basics for DCOMS, which is Districts Committee on Ministry, along with the Board of Ordination for the Texas Annual Conference administration of the United Methodist Denomination. I'm going to cover a lot of information, and I grew up in the Texas Annual Conference administration. My father was employed in the Texas Annual Conference administration of the United Methodist Denomination. His name was John Chester Dowden. He passed away in 2012. And my mother passed away in 2018. My mother's name was Grace Dowden. They were the losers that are responsible for my existence today. And I survived in spite of them, which I'm sure that if they had known that I was going to be exposing them, they probably would have made it possible that I did not survive them. However, here I am. And I went through decades of abuse, and I am here to tell my story. And the Texas Annual Conference administration of the United Methodist Denomination in Houston also shares some responsibility in the abuse and trauma that I experienced throughout my life. I have also experienced retaliation from the Texas Annual Conference administration of the United Methodist Denomination. I have been speaking out about them for years, since 2019 publicly. That's when I started talking about my story online. And I actually consulted with multiple attorneys before I did it. And I obtained a recorded conversation in 2017 of my mother where I directly asked her if she had drugged me with codeine, a narcotic, so that I would not know that my father was molesting me. And her response was a resounding with a lot of pride. And she was very proud to admit that, yeah, she did drug me with a narcotic codeine so that I would not know that my father was molesting me. I mean, the Texas Annual Conference should be so proud, I guess, right? Anyway, so I also was forced into the domestic relations office supervised visitation based on false accusations by my ex-husband, Carl Edward Anthony. And in the supervised visitation, I was forced temporarily to visit my kids at St. Stephen's United Methodist Church that is under the Texas Annual Conference administration in Houston, Texas. And it is the same administration that employed my father, John Chester Dowden, who was a child molester. The Texas Annual Conference also employed Kendall Graham, who sexually assaulted a minor on his couch in his office and videotaped it while he did it. They also employed Michael Tabb, who I'm also going to go into detail and discuss the fact that Michael Tabb murdered his wife, Marla Tabb, in Troop, Texas at the United Methodist Parsonage of the First United Methodist Church in Troop, Texas. This was before the First United Methodist Church in Troop, Texas separated from the Texas Annual Conference to join the Global Methodist Conference. Michael Tabb was employed under the Texas Annual Conference and placed on assignment at the First United Methodist Church in Troop, Texas. And that is where he murdered his wife, Marla Tabb. I also went through sexual harassment at the supervised visitation that took, and the sexual harassment that I had to go through took place at St. Stephen's United Methodist Church by a visiting parent, and it happened in front of the staff of the Domestic Relations Office. It also happened in front of the staff of St. Stephen's United Methodist Church. Why did I have to go through that? Well, I suppose it was my punishment for speaking out against the sexual assault and the sexual harassment that I was going through and that I went through by my father when he was employed under the Texas Annual Conference, because the Texas Annual Conference liked their victims to be compliant with sexual assault and sexual harassment, and I wasn't. So because of that, I was kicked out of supervised visitation, and today I can't see my kids. So since the Texas Annual Conference can retaliate against me in whatever way they choose to, regardless if it's legal or not, I can talk about their administration and their administrative policies and the clergy that they have employed who were capable of sexually assaulting minors. One murdered his wife, and another committed wire fraud. So I was also warned by two attorneys that the Texas Annual Conference would retaliate against me. Harrison Fisher had told me that the Texas Annual Conference would assist my ex-husband in getting our kids away from me, because I guess the, Texas Annual Conference, with their history of employing child abusers, men that are capable of abusing children, it wouldn't be far-fetched for them to help my ex-husband get custody of our sons. But now that doesn't really help their reputation, does it? Anyway, so I didn't understand how they could retaliate when Harrison Fisher was telling me. The way that it happened is that I had a family law attorney who grew up within the Texas Annual Conference. She was also upset that I was exposing the Texas Annual Conference before and during the custody trial. She told me to stop talking about the Texas Annual Conference or else. I asked her else what. She did not answer my question. She also told me to be careful what I said about the Texas Annual Conference because I didn't know what legal officials were involved with the Texas Annual Conference, which I already knew that. But speaking out against sexual abuse of children is a hill I will forever die on. And I don't care if the Texas Annual Conference likes it or not. Okay, so I'm going to get started. All right, so I was on page 2. And I'm going to continue on to page 3. And this is the basics for DCOMS, which is Districts Committee on Ministry. And I'm going to start where I left off, the registrar. The DCOM should elect a person other than the district superintendent or the chair of the DCOM to act as registrar for the committee. The duties are maintain a list of candidates under DCOM Care 666.3 and share candidate information and status with CRA. CRA is Candidacy and Recruitment Assistant. To be the custodian for all DCOM files, all DCOM candidate files, including psychological assessment reports, belong to the annual conference. See record keeping section, which follows. To keep a separate file on each person for whom the DCOM is responsible. To inform the persons responsible what materials are needed for each file, interview, and instruct the DCOM on what actions to take. To promptly, within 10 days, inform the CM of all actions taken on persons under the care of the DCOM. See one-page DCOM action report. To transfer individual files to another district or annual conference upon receipt of a written request. To keep all persons interviewed by the district committee informed about decisions and recommendations promptly within 10 days in writing. Psychological officer. This officer should maintain communication with the Board of Ordained Ministry psychological officer for the receipt, utilization, and return of the psychological assessment report. The duties are: receive the psychological reports from the BOM psychological officer for use in the DCOM process of candidate evaluation. Review the psychological report for the candidate's potential for gaining sufficient levels of competence and readiness for ordained ministry. Let me read that again. Review the psychological report for the candidate's potential for gaining sufficient levels of competence and readiness for ordained ministry. Well, you know, it seems like the Texas Annual Conference must have their hands full psychologically assessing potential clergy. And maybe they should focus on that instead of coming after the mental health of their own victims, shouldn't they? Do you agree, boys?
Yes, I do.
My husband agrees. He's on the phone. He's always on the phone with me.
Hi.
Okay, I'm going to continue. The duties are: receive the psychological reports from the BOM, Board of Ordained Ministry psychological officer for use in the DCOM process of candidate evaluation. Review the psychological report for the candidate's potential for gaining sufficient levels of competence and readiness for ordained ministry, rather than focus on the mental health of their own victims. Help DCOM members interpret reports. Honor issues of confidentiality as outlined in the authorization for release of information signed by the candidate. Executive Secretary, optional. This office may be filled by the district superintendent or district administrative assistant. The duties are to record the minutes of each meeting and distribute copies to committee members. If a recording secretary has not been assigned this responsibility, to conduct correspondence and business necessary for the efficient functioning of the committee as directed by the chairperson. Functions of the committee. Confidentiality. Isn't that interesting? Above all, as a member of a DCOM, you must keep all conversations and all decisions strictly confidential. I don't know, maybe don't sign contracts with attorneys that cannot uphold client confidentiality. Perhaps the Texas Annual Conference could consider that, since, you know, they're so focused on confidentiality. Maybe they should look at their lack of confidentiality and ethics. But that's just me. If there is any question about whether a certain action, statement, or story can be shared with others, assume it to be confidential until you have explicit instructions to assume otherwise. And I don't know, perhaps, don't enter into a legal contract with an attorney who hasn't been honest with his client that he at one time was employed under the Texas Annual Conference as a local pastor. Therefore, it would be a conflict of interest, wouldn't it? All right, interviewing. Most of each committee's time together is spent interviewing candidates. DCOMs are responsible for many different types of interviews, of course. The purpose and expectations of each interview is shaped by the decision asked for in any interview. For example, the purpose of interviewing a candidate for certification is different from the purpose of interviewing a candidate for provisional membership. In general, when interviewing candidates for certification, you are trying to determine fitness for ministry. How does that work? When the Texas Annual Conference and the Board of Ordained Ministry has a history of approving clergy who are capable of committing crimes, I don't know, like sexually assaulting a minor, I don't know, maybe murdering his wife in a United Methodist parsonage, wire fraud. Okay. Commissioning. You are trying to determine readiness for ministry. Recertification. You are trying to determine continued fitness for ministry and progress in completing theological education. Relicensing. You are trying to determine continued fitness for ministry, readiness for licensed ministry, and progress in course of study. All right. So next, I'm going to continue reading the article about Michael Tabb. And this is Unholy Homicide Part 2 by David Lohr, Lohr. And it's about the Tabb murder investigation. According to later reports, the Galveston County Daily News, when police arrived at the Tabb's First United Methodist parsonage, they found Marla lying in the couple's bedroom in a pool of blood. She was beaten beyond recognition. Overturned lamps and picture frames in the bedroom showed Marla struggled fiercely with her attacker. Investigators also noticed her attacker went to great lengths to clean up the crime scene, but left behind a large wooden table with 2 legs broken off, one of which was nowhere to be found. When questioned about his wife's death, Reverend Tabb said he had left home earlier that day with his 2-year-old son to run some errands and returned home to find the front door open and his wife dead. The couple's 6-week-old son was inside the home at the time of the murder, but he was not harmed. Following standard procedure, homicide detectives asked Reverend Tabb to turn over his clothes and shoes and suggested he take the children to a safe place. As the investigation into Marla's murder progressed, Smith County Sheriff J.B. Smith issued a press release which briefly described the crime scene and Marla's cause of death. Preliminary results from the Southwestern Forensic Lab in Dallas confirmed that 35-year-old Marla Tabb died from severe blunt force trauma to the head and face area. While it was not mentioned in the initial release, the trauma to Marla's face was so severe that her jaw was virtually shattered. And the person responsible for this was a clergy that was employed under the Texas Annual Conference administration of the United Methodist Denomination in Houston, Texas. The same administration that is involved with the supervised visitations through the Domestic Relations Office. And they are letting the Domestic Relations Office use 2 of their churches for supervised visitation. How is the Texas Annual Conference assisting in protecting children in supervised visitation when they employed a man who brutally beat his wife so severely in a United Methodist parsonage and beat her beyond recognition? How are they protecting children when they are capable of employing someone who is capable of such a horrific crime? And why wouldn't the Texas Annual Conference be honest and straightforward with the visiting parents and the custodial parents and also the Domestic Relations Office? Hey, by the way, we have 3 clergy who were convicted of crimes in the state of Texas. Well, one of them wasn't. I'm going to cover the details of that. I'm not as familiar as the details with that. How does that happen? How is the Texas Annual Conference assisting in protecting children in the supervised visitation when they have a history of employing clergy who are capable of sexually assaulting minors? Okay. Investigators soon turned to members of Reverend Tabb's congregation and also interviewed friends and family members. Some said the couple had been having recent domestic problems, but nothing they would consider uncommon for a couple that recently relocated and had another child. See, right there, that statement is watering down domestic violence. There's so much that can go on behind closed doors that people don't know anything about. Clearly, there were signs by that statement. And Marla Tabb is not here to tell her story today, but I would be willing to bet that if Marla Tabb were alive to tell her story, the Texas Annual Conference would have wanted her to keep her damn mouth shut. Just like they wanted me to keep quiet. Because they want their victims silent. Okay. Friends who attended Marla's funeral said Reverend Tabb seemed greatly depressed and his face carried the deep pain of a widower. Nonetheless, authorities had their suspicions about Reverend Tabb, especially after photos surfaced which showed the minister in a topless bar just 5 days after the murder of his wife. And this was a United Methodist minister that was employed under the Texas Annual Conference Administration in Houston, Texas. Investigators also wondered why there were no signs of forced entry the night of the murder. Something wasn't right. Nothing was stolen, and Marla was not sexually assaulted. But the Texas Annual Conference never would have cared about that either, if she had been. So then, what was the killer's motive? All right, so this is about the arrest. This is still Unholy Homicide, Part 2, by David Lohr, Lohr. And on August 14th, 2002, authorities issued a warrant for the arrest of Reverend Michael Tabb, saying they found blood on his shoes and in his truck bed. So what they did was he cleaned up the blood in his truck bed, and he cleaned up the blood on his shoes. But they sprayed his truck bed with luminol, and they sprayed his shoes with luminol, and they lit up. Later that day, Tabb surrendered to authorities in the presence of his attorney. However, he was later released from Smith County Jail after posting $50,000 bond. So this is a United Methodist minister that was employed under the Texas Annual Conference Administration of the United Methodist Denomination in Houston, who brutally beat his wife beyond recognition to her death in a United Methodist parsonage, and he was released on $50,000 bond. Following Tabb's arrest, Troop Mayor John Whitesell told reporters from CNN and the Tri-County leader the community was angry and disappointed. Really. There were signs of domestic violence, and no one did anything, including the Texas Conference. And honestly, anybody who witnesses domestic violence from a clergy or within a clergy family, that should be reported immediately to the district superintendent and up the chain to the conference office. But I already know how they handle situations like that. The person we trusted to guide our spiritual beliefs, at least allegedly, turned against everything we stand for, Whitesell said. The church will always remember this. Former neighbors in North Carolina were shocked to hear of the pastor's arrest. No way. There's no indicators whatsoever. There were no indicators whatsoever, quoted Maureen Ruiz, a former neighbor, told the Tyler Morning Telegraph. I would have been able to tell. They all think they would be able to tell. And when they see the signs, they do nothing. Following this release from the Smith County Jail, Reverend Tabb went to stay with his parents in Tyler, Texas. Shortly thereafter, his attorney, F.R. Buck Files, contacted District Attorney Jack Skeen Jr. to discuss possible plea bargain. The two men eventually came to a mutual agreement, whereas Tab would plead guilty to murdering his wife in exchange for a 50-year sentence, with the possibility of parole, rather than the possibility of life imprisonment. He should have gotten life. Once all sides were in agreement, Tab's hearing was set for May 14th, 2003. On the date of the hearing, Michael Tab was a no-show. Instead, he walked from his parents' home to the University of Texas Tyler campus, where he slashed his throat and tossed the knife into a pond on the campus. Unfortunately for Tab, his attempt was unsuccessful. And when he was discharged from a local hospital, he was booked into Smith County Jail. Tab agreed to plead guilty, as he initially promised. However, the district's attorney amended the original agreement, adding an additional 5 years to Tab's suicide attempt. Tab refused to agree to the new terms and requested a trial. Unholy Homicide Part 2. On September 29th of 2003, in lieu of his trial scheduled to begin on October 16th, an emotionless Reverend Michael Tab stood before State District Judge Cynthia Kent and accepted the prosecution's plea bargain. As a result of his guilty plea, Tab was sentenced to 55 years in prison. Following the brief hearing, both sides made statements to the press. We've never had a case where a reverend or a pastor had committed murder, Matt Bingham, chief felony prosecutor for Smith County, told Stars and Stripes magazine. We still don't know the motive. Bingham also said that under Texas law, Tab would not be eligible for parole for decades. He'll do 27 and a half years, day for day, before a parole officer ever hears from him. In speaking with the Charlotte Observer, Tab's lawyer, F.R. Buck Files, said some cases should be resolved without a trial, and this was one of them. There was never a question whether Mike killed Marla. It was only why. I agree with his decision. The minister's lawyer also told the Associated Press that Tab accepted the plea in state district court to spare his family and his wife's family the pain of a trial. He also wanted to ensure that his children would never hear the unpleasant details. Unfortunately, Reverend Tab will never get his wish, for the story of his brutal crime has already been told. Okay. So I'm going to share a little bit of my theory why I think that Michael Tab, what his motive could have been. He was an abuser. He could have been concerned that his wife was going to leave him and it would get out. His secret wild life would get out and ruin his career. Pastors, clergy, United Methodist, Baptist, whatever the denomination is, they have a sense of entitlement. They enjoy the attention. They enjoy the power that they have, the liberties that they have, and they don't want to lose that. And he was far more concerned about losing that. It's possible he thought that people, in his delusion, people would believe him, that someone else murdered his wife and he would get away with it. And he wouldn't have to answer for the fact that he was going to clubs, strip clubs, while he was married. And he would have rather gotten rid of Marla Tabb so she could not get in the way of his ego. Also, in the video of the Dateline story, just before he murdered her, she caught him molesting their 2-year-old in the bathtub. He had a lot to lose in the event that she decided to leave him. And another sad part of this is that the Texas Annual Conference does not care what happens to their victims. What they're more concerned about is that their victims are silent. But I am not, and I will never be silent.